Eight armed men just tried to steal one of America's most powerful tech companies, and the only person standing between them and billions of dollars wasn't a federal agent, wasn't a trained SWAT commander, wasn't even someone whose name appeared on the official security roster. He was a temporary hire, a single father working a one-night gig to keep the lights on, and in 24 seconds, he changed everything. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because the stories we tell don't come quietly. Drop a comment with your city and country right now so I can see exactly how far this story has traveled. Hit like if you're already hooked. Stay until the end. You won't see the twist coming. The earpiece crackled once, then went silent. Nathan Mercer adjusted it with 2 fingers, a habit, not a nervous tick, and went back to watching the loading dock entrance where 3 catering vans were backing in at slightly irregular intervals. Not wrong exactly, just slightly off in the way that most people's instincts were too polished to catch anymore. He'd been on the job for 6 hours. Technically, his shift started at 4. He'd arrived at 2:30 and walked every exit corridor twice before anyone from the permanent team noticed him. "You the temp?" The man who'd found him in the east stairwell had the look of someone who used his badge to open doors he didn't need to go through, broad shoulders, a jaw that had never been hit hard enough to change its attitude. His name tag read D. Colton, head of security. "Nathan Mercer," Nathan said. "Tactical Solutions sent me over." "Right." Colton looked him up and down the way people look at rental furniture. "You're covering the service entrance and the 3rd floor overflow corridor. Stay off the main floor unless I call you in. The gala guests don't need to see temp staff." Nathan didn't say anything to that. "We clear?" Colton asked. "We're clear." He'd spent 11 years as a Navy SEAL. He'd done 3 combat deployments and 2 that he'd never be able to talk about in any room with a window. He knew what dismissal felt like because he'd used it himself, deployed it deliberately when he needed someone to underestimate him. What he'd learned in all those years was that the most dangerous person in any room was almost never the one everyone was watching. He went back to the service entrance and kept watching. The Hawthorne Dynamics Annual Achievement Gala was the kind of event that cost more to produce than most hospitals operated on in a quarter. The Grand Meridian Ballroom in downtown Chicago had been rented out entirely, 12,000 square feet of marble flooring and ceiling chandeliers that had been imported from somewhere in Austria. The guest list ran to 470 names, and every single one of them was either worth something, owed something, or knew where to find it. Hawthorne Dynamics wasn't just a tech company. It had started as a defense contractor 15 years ago, pivoted into proprietary artificial intelligence infrastructure, and was now embedded so deeply into financial networks, municipal systems, and federal security contracts that losing its core intellectual property, would create a gap that competitors would spend the next decade trying to fill. The woman who'd built it into that was 30 years old. Nathan had seen Evelyn Brooks on exactly 3 television screens in the past 6 hours, 2 in the security monitoring room and 1 in the lobby where a local cable news station was running a profile piece ahead of tonight's announcement. He hadn't paid much attention to any of them. He wasn't there to be impressed by her, but you couldn't work any kind of protection job without building a baseline picture of the principal, even when nobody had told you she was a principal. Early 30s, he'd thought, before the ID badge confirmed 30. The kind of smart that other people found exhausting because she talked to you like she already knew what you were going to say and was deciding whether it was worth waiting for you to say it. She wore a dark navy dress that was expensive without performing its own expense. She moved through spaces like someone who'd spent years learning to fill rooms without letting them swallow her. She also, he noticed on the lobby monitor, had shaken hands with 7 people in the last 4 minutes and remembered every one of their names without being prompted. That was a particular kind of intelligence. Not book intelligence, not strategic intelligence, the human kind, the kind that kept track of people instead of just using them. He filed it away and went back to the loading dock. The first thing that caught his attention was a badge. Not a missing badge, not a counterfeit badge. He couldn't have confirmed that at 20 feet in bad lighting. What caught his attention was how a man in catering whites was wearing his badge clipped to his left breast pocket instead of his right, which was where Meridian's catering contract required all service staff to position theirs. A trivial detail. The kind of thing that appeared in operational briefings as a reminder that details were how you got caught, and details were also how you caught other people. Nathan watched the man move a cart through the loading bay doors. He didn't go to Colton yet. He went to Camera 4. Camera 4 covered the Northeast Service Corridor, a straight shot from the loading dock to the kitchen, and if you followed it past the walk-in freezers, to the secondary stairwell that connected to the ballroom's mezzanine level. When Nathan pulled it up on the handheld monitor he'd been issued, the feed showed an empty corridor. The corridor was not empty. He'd walked it 20 minutes ago, and there'd been 2 catering staff staging equipment near the freezer doors. He checked Camera 7. Camera 7 covered the west exterior approach and was supposed to give a wide-angle view of the valet circle. What it gave instead was a perfect, static image of an empty driveway. An image he was fairly certain had been loaded into the feed as a still frame sometime in the last 40 minutes, because the timestamp in the corner was cycling normally, but the shadow from the decorative concrete pillar on the east side of the frame hadn't moved in the 4 minutes he'd been watching. Someone had put a photograph over a live camera feed. Nathan stood in the service corridor and thought about that for a moment. Not frantically, just working it through the way he'd learned to work things through. Calmly, because panic used up cognitive resources you needed for something else. This was not a smash and grab. Whatever was happening tonight had been planned by people who understood security infrastructure well enough to manipulate it without tripping the obvious alarms. That meant inside access. That meant someone in the building, someone who'd been in the building long enough to map the camera system, was part of it. He keyed his radio. Mercer to Colton. Static, then. What is it, Mercer? Not a question, a statement that was barely tolerating being interrupted. I've got a dead camera feed on 7, still image playing on a loop, and I'm seeing a badge worn wrong on one of the catering staff who came in through loading bay C about 6 minutes ago. Silence. Colton. I heard you. Another pause. Camera 7's been glitchy all week, and badges get worn wrong by tired caterers all the time, Mercer. These aren't enemy combatants, they're people trying to set up a shrimp cocktail station. Nathan breathed in slowly through his nose. The shadow on the camera image hasn't moved in 4 minutes, he said. The sun hasn't stopped moving. Are you a meteorologist now? No. Then stay on your post and let me do my job. The radio clicked off. Nathan stood there for a moment longer. Then he put the radio back on his belt and started walking toward the Northeast Service Corridor, because Colton could dismiss him all he wanted, but Colton wasn't the one who'd noticed, and noticing was the only job that actually mattered. Knut. The second thing he found was harder to explain away. In the Northeast Corridor, tucked behind a linen cart staged near the freezer units, was a duffel bag. Black nylon, military-grade zipper hardware, not the kind of bag that came with a catering company's standard equipment load. He didn't open it. He crouched down and read what he could read without touching it. The weight distribution suggested something dense and low center. The zipper had been closed in a specific direction that meant the last person to open it was right-handed and had done it in a hurry. And then he stood up and looked at the 2 men further down the corridor who were moving slowly in the direction of the secondary stairwell. They were wearing Meridian venue security uniforms. Nathan knew every face on the venue security team. He'd spent his first 2 hours at the venue making sure of that, not because anyone had told him to, but because he'd spent 11 years in environments where the face you didn't recognize was the face that got you killed. He didn't recognize either of these men. He pulled out his phone and called Tactical Solutions dispatch line, bypassing Colton entirely. This is Mercer, badge 1147. I'm working the Hawthorne Dynamics Gala at the Grand Meridian. I need you to contact Federal Security Liaison and request a welfare check. I've got possible hostile infiltration, compromised camera infrastructure, and unidentified individuals in venue security uniforms operating in the service corridor. The dispatcher, to her credit, didn't argue with him. She told him she'd escalate it immediately. He figured he had about 20 minutes before anyone with authority arrived. He didn't think he had 20 minutes. Upstairs, the gala was in full swing. Evelyn Brooks stood near the edge of the elevated stage where a podium had been positioned overlooking the ballroom floor, and she was trying to focus on what her vice chairman was saying to her instead of running numbers in her head. Richard Ashford was 71 years old, had silver hair he still kept cut military short from his 2 years in the Army before law school, and had been with the company since before it had a logo. He was the person who'd taught her that the most important word in any negotiation was patience, which he'd said to her once with a severity that made her think he hadn't entirely meant it as advice about business. "You look like you're preparing for a deposition," he said to her now, over the rim of his glass. "I'm preparing for a speech." "Same posture." "Richard?" She turned to look at him directly. "Is there something you want to say to me before I go up there?" He started to answer, and then something in his expression shifted. Not visibly, not to anyone else in the room, but Evelyn had known this man for 9 years, and she read him the way she read balance sheets, looking for what wasn't said as much as what was. "No," he said. "You're going to do fine." She let it go. She had a speech to give. Nathan was on the mezzanine level when Evelyn Brooks walked to the podium. He'd stationed himself at the top of the secondary stairwell, the one the 2 unidentified guards had been moving toward, because from that position he could see the ballroom floor, the main entrance corridor, and the service access point simultaneously. It wasn't his assigned post. If Colton spotted him, he was going to have a problem. He'd decided that was a problem he could manage later. Evelyn's voice came through the ballroom speaker system clearly, composed, unhurried, the kind of voice that had learned not to rise in pitch when it was nervous. Hawthorne Dynamics exists because of a very specific belief, she was saying, that the most dangerous thing a company can do is treat its own people as variables instead of constants. Polite laughter. Applause from the tables near the front. Nathan wasn't listening to the speech. He was counting uniforms. There were 8 of them positioned around the ballroom perimeter. 4 he recognized from the briefing earlier, 4 he didn't. The 4 he didn't recognize had positioned themselves in a pattern that he'd seen before. Not in a corporate security context, but in a close-quarters tactical one. They were spaced to create overlapping coverage zones. They weren't protecting the room, they were containing it. He started moving down the staircase. He wasn't going to make it in time. He knew that when he was still on the 3rd step from the top, because the 4 unrecognized guards were already moving, smoothly, professionally, without any signal he could detect, and converging on the stage from 4 different angles while Evelyn was mid-sentence. He went faster. But Evelyn noticed them at the same moment the room did, which was the moment they were already on the stage. The man who stepped up beside her was wearing a Grand Meridian security uniform, and he had the face of someone who'd decided before he walked up those steps that he wasn't interested in what she was going to say. "Ms. Brooks." His voice was quiet enough that only she and the nearest microphone could hear it. "You need to step back from the podium." She didn't step back. "Who are you?" "Someone who's about to make this very simple for you." He reached past her and pulled the microphone from its stand, and when he spoke again, his voice went out across the entire room. "Ladies and gentlemen, your attention please. This company is currently under an emergency executive authority transfer. Ms. Brooks will be providing her authorization codes in approximately 4 minutes. If everyone remains calm and cooperative, tonight will be a minor inconvenience." 470 people went completely still. Evelyn's hands tightened on the edge of the podium. She didn't reach for the emergency button on her phone. She didn't yell for security. She looked out at the room, at 470 faces that were all looking back at her, waiting to see what she was going to do, and she said quietly to the man beside her, "You have no idea what you've walked into." He smiled at her. "Neither do you." The other 7 armed men moved to contain the crowd, and Nathan Mercer came through the side door. Quote, he moved before anyone in the ballroom had processed what they were seeing. He'd done enough close-quarters work to know that hesitation was the variable that got people killed, and he'd spent 20 years removing that variable from his operating system. The first man, nearest the stage left entrance, went down before he'd fully turned around. Second, third. He used what he had: controlled force, precise targeting, the kind of efficiency that wasn't elegant but was fast. He wasn't performing anything. He was working. The man on stage reached for the weapon at his hip. Nathan was already between him and Evelyn by the time his hand got there. What happened next took 24 seconds. He knew because he'd trained himself to count during action sequences. Not the seconds themselves, but the intervals, the gaps between contact and response. and he counted 7 gaps and 7 outcomes. And when it was over, all 8 men were on the floor of the Grand Meridian Ballroom, and 470 people were standing in the kind of silence that happens when an audience hasn't figured out yet whether what they just watched was real. Nathan looked down at his hands, a split knuckle on the right from the 5th contact. Nothing else. He looked up at Evelyn Brooks, who was still standing at the podium. She was looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite categorize. Not fear, not relief, something more complicated than either. "We need to move," he said. "Right now. This isn't over." She didn't argue. She came around the side of the podium and followed him toward the service door. And Nathan Mercer, temporary hire, invisible staff, the man Colton had assigned to keep out of sight, walked her into the service corridor and started figuring out what came next. His earpiece crackled once. Colton's voice came through, taut and tight. "Mercer, what the hell did you just do?" Nathan pulled the earpiece out and put it in his jacket pocket. He had a better use for his ears right now. The service corridor smelled like industrial cleaning solution and old carpet adhesive, and the fluorescent tube overhead had been flickering at irregular intervals since Nathan pulled the door shut behind them. He counted the flicker pattern out of habit. 3 seconds on, half a second off, repeat, and decided it wasn't a power issue. It was a bad ballast, the kind of maintenance problem that got logged and ignored in buildings that spent their budget on chandeliers instead of infrastructure. Evelyn was 2 steps ahead of him, moving fast in heels that were not designed for concrete flooring, and she was doing it without complaint, which told him something useful about her. "Left at the junction," he said quietly. "I know this building." She turned left without breaking stride. "I've used this corridor 3 times during fire drill protocols." "Good. Then you know the secondary stairwell on this level connects to the kitchen loading platform. It also connects to the basement mechanical room." "That's where we're going." She slowed slightly and looked back at him. Not stopping, just recalibrating. "Why the mechanical room?" "Because whoever set this up knew the camera grid. They put a still image over camera 7 and probably did the same to at least 2 others. The mechanical room has a hardwired intercom panel that bypasses the building's main communication system. It runs on its own circuit." She was quiet for a beat. "You found a compromised camera in the first 2 hours of your shift?" "Yes." "And you reported it to Colton?" "Yes." "And he dismissed it?" Nathan didn't answer that because the answer was obvious and repeating it wasted time. He moved her forward instead, keeping his right hand free and his body positioned slightly between her and the corridor ahead. Old habit. The kind that didn't feel like a habit anymore because it had become structural. The way certain things become when you've done them long enough under conditions where failing to do them had real consequences. They passed the walk-in freezer units. One of the doors was ajar. Nathan registered that without stopping. Then he heard footsteps from the junction ahead. He caught Evelyn's arm and pulled her into the alcove beside the freezer. Too hard, probably. Harder than he needed to. And she made a sharp sound but didn't pull away. He put one finger up. She understood. 2 sets of footsteps, moving with that particular cadence. Measured, systematic, not the footsteps of catering staff or lost guests. These were people covering a corridor the way you cover a corridor when you've been trained to do it. Nathan counted the seconds as the footsteps grew louder, peaked, and then gradually diminished in the other direction. He let out a slow breath. "They're sweeping the service level," he said, low. "Looking for us specifically or clearing a route. Either way, we're on a clock." "How many of them?" Evelyn asked. Her voice was steady, which he respected and also noted as something that could work against her if she started trusting it too much. "Don't know. The 8 in the ballroom weren't the whole team. The whole team would have had exit routes covered before the primary move happened." She processed that. So this was coordinated well in advance. Very well in advance. He stepped back out into the corridor and moved them forward again, taking a different angle toward the stairwell. The camera manipulation alone takes time. You need access to the building's security infrastructure, you need a window to install the loop, and you need someone who can do it without triggering the anomaly detection on the monitoring system, which means someone who knows how our monitoring system is configured. Yes. She didn't say anything else, but he could hear what she was thinking because it was the same thing he was thinking. That kind of knowledge didn't come from outside. It came from inside. It came from someone who'd had regular access, over time, to systems that most people in the company never thought about. They reached the stairwell door. Nathan checked the handle, unlocked, which was correct, and eased it open 6 inches before going through, because 6 inches was enough to clear the visual field on the other side without committing to a position you couldn't recover from. The stairwell was empty. They went down. The mechanical room was exactly where Evelyn said it would be, past the utility staging area, through a heavy fire door that required a keycard she didn't have, and Nathan opened with a technique that left a small gouge in the doorframe and would probably generate a maintenance ticket tomorrow, assuming tomorrow happened normally. He found the intercom panel on the north wall behind a rack of electrical conduit. Gray steel, institutional, the kind of equipment that got installed in 1987 and never replaced because it worked and nobody thought about it. He lifted the handset and heard a dial tone, which meant the line was live. He dialed the direct number for the Chicago field office of the FBI, which he knew because he'd looked it up 3 months ago during a different job at a federal building downtown, and the kind of person Nathan Mercer was meant that he'd memorized it without deciding to. The line rang 4 times. Then a voice. Federal Bureau of Investigation, Chicago Division. How can I? My name is Nathan Mercer, former Navy SEAL, contractor badge 1147 with Tactical Solutions Group. I'm currently inside the Grand Meridian Hotel with the CEO of Hawthorne Dynamics, Evelyn Brooks. The company's annual gala has been targeted by a coordinated armed infiltration. 8 hostiles have been neutralized in the main ballroom, but the operation is ongoing. I have reason to believe the building's security infrastructure has been compromised from the inside, and additional hostile personnel are currently active inside the building. A pause. Then the voice changed register slightly, tighter, faster. Can you verify your identity? Badge number 1147, Tactical Solutions Group, Chicago licensee. Run it. I'll hold. He didn't hold. He kept talking because holding wasn't something he could afford right now. I need you to dispatch to the Grand Meridian, ground floor, and I need you to know that your point of contact inside this building, the head of security, a man named D. Colton, may be compromised. Do not coordinate with him. Do not take direction from him. Go around him. Another pause, longer this time. Sir, I'm going to need to send people first, verify me after. Every minute you spend verifying me is a minute this operation progresses. He set the handset down without hanging up, leaving the line open, which was standard practice for exactly this kind of situation, and turned back to Evelyn. She was standing in the center of the mechanical room with her arms crossed, not because she was cold, but because she was holding herself together, and that was the physical expression of it. She'd probably been doing it for years without noticing. FBI, she said. Open line. They'll trace the location. How long? If they move fast, 15 minutes. If they follow protocol first, longer. He looked around the room, cataloging exits and angles. We're not going to sit here for 15 minutes. No, she agreed. We're not. She uncrossed her arms. What did you mean when you said the operation is ongoing? Those men in the ballroom, they weren't trying to kidnap me. No. They needed me there. They needed me alive and at the podium. She was working through it in real time, which he could see in the way her eyes moved, not looking at anything in the room, looking at something internal. The emergency executive protocol. Nathan looked at her. Talk me through it, he said. It's a fail-safe. She sat down on a utility bench along the wall, not because she needed a rest, but because she was going to explain something complicated, and she thought better without her body distracting her. If there's ever a catastrophic leadership failure, CEO incapacitation, hostile takeover attempt, criminal investigation, the board can invoke an emergency executive authority transfer. It temporarily centralizes all executive decision-making power into a single authorization point, which requires what to activate? A biometric confirmation from the sitting CEO, retinal scan, voice authorization, and a 12-digit code. She paused. The code changes every 72 hours. The current code is only in my head. Nathan sat with that. So they weren't trying to remove you, he said slowly. They were trying to use you. They needed me conscious, cooperative looking, and standing in front of a system terminal. If I authorize the emergency protocol, even under duress, the transfer is legally binding for a 72-hour window. During that window, whoever holds the authorization token has complete executive authority over the company's assets, contracts, and intellectual property, which they could use to transfer proprietary technology. Billions of dollars worth, defense AI architecture, encryption systems, infrastructure integration patents. If someone got access to all of it for 72 hours with full executive authority, they could copy, sell, or destroy everything we've built before anyone could legally stop them. She looked at him. And they'd have the company's own authorization codes on record as justification. My authorization, my biometric data. The picture was clicking into place in Nathan's head with the particular clarity that came not from intelligence alone, but from experience, from having sat in enough operational briefings to understand the shape of what careful, patient, institutional planning looked like when it finally executed. They've been inside this company, he said. Not just tonight, for a long time. Yes. Her voice was flat. Not shocked, past shocked. Who knew about the emergency protocol's structure? Who would have known it required your physical presence and biometric confirmation? Board members, C-suite executives. She stopped. And the head of security. Because the protocol has a physical security component. The terminal requires a security officer's key to unlock before the CEO authorization can even begin. Nathan thought about Colton's voice on the radio, the speed of the dismissal, the flat certainty. Colton, he said, I don't know that. I do. Not arrogance, just pattern recognition. He had access to the camera system. He dismissed my report without investigation. He knew exactly which corridor I was assigned to, which meant he knew where I wouldn't be. He stood up. He's not just compromised, he's directing it. Evelyn absorbed that without argument. Then, Richard? Your vice chairman? Richard Ashford. He tried to tell me something before I went up to the podium. I could see it in his face. He'd been trying to decide whether to say something for most of the evening. She stood. If he knew something was wrong, if he figured out even part of this, then he's a liability to whoever's running this. I need to find him. Nathan was already running the layout in his head, the building's floor plan as he'd memorized it from the pre-shift briefing materials, the positions of the hostile personnel he'd last tracked, the distance between the mechanical room and the secondary floors. Finding one specific person in a building that was currently being managed by an unknown number of armed operatives was not a clean calculation. There's a secondary monitoring station on the second floor, he said. Facilities management office. If it's not been taken over, it'll have access to whatever cameras are still running genuine feeds. We can try to locate Ashford visually before we move toward him. And if it has been taken over, then we find out fast and we leave faster. He moved to the fire door. Stay 2 steps behind me, stay quiet, and if I tell you to run, you run, and you don't look back to check on me. Understood? She didn't like that condition. He could see it, but she was smart enough to know that liking a condition wasn't the same as whether the condition made sense. Understood, she said. They went back into the stairwell. Maz. The second floor was quieter than Nathan expected, which was not a good sign. In his experience, buildings that were supposed to be occupied and weren't had a specific quality of silence. Not peaceful, not empty, but held. Like a breath that hadn't been released yet. The second floor of the Grand Meridian had that quality in every corridor they moved through, and Nathan tracked it by the small details. A service cart stopped in the middle of a hallway with nothing unloaded from it. A fire door propped open 6 inches with a rubber wedge that hadn't been there during his earlier walkthrough. A ceiling tile in the northwest junction that was very slightly out of alignment. Someone had gone through this floor systematically. They'd either cleared it of witnesses or they'd positioned people in it. He didn't know which yet. The facilities management office was at the end of the east corridor, marked with a placard that said "Authorized Personnel" in a font that suggested whoever ordered it had thought a more serious font would help. Nathan tried the handle. Locked, which was standard after hours. He looked at Evelyn. She reached into the small clutch she was still carrying, which he'd forgotten about somehow, because it seemed absurd to still be carrying a clutch in this situation. But then again, she'd had 400 things happen in the last 20 minutes, and pulled out a keycard on a thin lanyard. "Master access," she said, "for exactly the kind of situation where I need to get into a room quickly." "Does the head of security know you have one of those?" A beat. "Yes." "Then assume every door it should open, they've thought about." She swiped it anyway, because they didn't have a better option, and the lock disengaged with a click that sounded enormous in the silent corridor. The room was small and smelled like burned coffee and old desk chair. 4 monitor screens on one wall, a workstation, filing cabinets. One of the monitors was showing a live feed, the north exterior approach, cars still coming and going at the valet circle, completely unaware, and 3 were dark. Nathan sat at the workstation and navigated to the camera management interface. 11 of the building's 23 cameras were showing live feeds. 8 were dark, disabled. 4 were showing loop footage. "They left the exterior cameras running," he said, half to himself. "Why?" "Because shutting down exterior cameras triggers an automatic alert to the city's security grid. They couldn't touch those without drawing attention they weren't ready for." He scrolled through the live feeds. Lobby. 1 hostile, positioned near the main entrance, visible only because Nathan knew what he was looking for. Main corridor. Clear. Ballroom anteroom. He stopped. The anteroom camera showed 3 figures. 2 of them were in the aggressive posture of people maintaining control of a situation. The third was seated in a chair with his hands behind him, and even on the grainy monitor feed, the silver hair and upright posture of a man who'd spent 2 years in the army before law school was recognizable. "Richard," Evelyn said quietly. "Second floor anteroom." Nathan mapped it. "That's not far from the main corridor junction." "They've got him." "They've had him for a while, I think." He looked at the timestamp on the feed. The anteroom camera had been recording continuously, which meant they hadn't thought to loop it. He scrolled back 15 minutes. Ashford had been put in that chair before the ballroom confrontation began. They moved him before the main event, before the speech. They knew he suspected something. Or they needed him out of position. He leaned closer to the screen. The 2 figures flanking Ashford weren't wearing venue security uniforms. They were in the business casual clothes of people who'd been at the gala as guests. He thought about the 470 names on the guest list and how thoroughly he'd been told not to think about them. "I'm going to get him," Nathan said. Evelyn turned to look at him. "You can't go into that anteroom alone." "I'm not asking for permission." "I'm not offering permission. I'm making an observation." She looked at the screen again, at the image of Richard Ashford sitting straight-backed in a chair with his hands behind him, and something in her face shifted into a territory that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief. "He's the only person in that company who's known me longer than I've known myself. He hired me for my first internship when I was 19 years old, and he spent the next 10 years arguing with everyone who said I wasn't ready." She looked at Nathan. "So I'm going with you." "No. You said you needed someone who knows this building." "You said it was useful that I knew the building. The anteroom has 2 entrances, the main corridor door, and a second door that connects to the conference suite behind it. The conference suite has an access panel for the building's PA system that can be used to create a distraction. I know where it is and how to operate it. You don't." She held his gaze. "And I'm going with you." Nathan looked at her for a long moment. She was scared. He could see that clearly. Not the bone-deep freezing kind, but the operational kind. The fear that makes your hands steadier because your body has decided it needs them to be. He recognized it because it was the same fear he'd felt in every situation where the stakes were actual. "Fine," he said. "But you do exactly what I tell you, when I tell you. Within reason. Not within reason, exactly." A pause. "Fine," she said. They left the facilities office and moved into the corridor, and Nathan was already mapping the approach in his head. Angles, timing, the likely response speed of 2 men who'd been standing over a seated old man for 20 minutes and had started to feel comfortable about it. That comfort was going to be a problem for them. The conference suite door was unlocked, which Nathan didn't trust, and the room beyond it was dark, which was either good or deeply bad depending on what was in it. He cleared it in 8 seconds, standard, systematic, the way it was done, and found nothing except stacked chairs and a folding table and the PA access panel on the east wall that Evelyn had described. She moved to it immediately, pulling open the panel cover with the confidence of someone who'd had to locate that panel in the dark during a fire drill and hadn't forgotten where it was. Inside, a row of switches, a volume dial, a handheld transmitter on a cradle. "If I put a tone through the building PA," she said quietly, "it'll create noise in the anteroom, a second or two of distraction. That's all I need." He moved to the connecting door between the conference suite and the anteroom. Through it, muffled but audible, he could hear one of the two men talking. Low, professional, the tone of someone giving a periodic check-in over a phone line. "Wait for my signal." He positioned himself at the door. He thought briefly about his daughter. Not intentionally, just the way she appeared sometimes in the half-second before something happened. Her face specifically, the way she looked when she was concentrating on something, the small line between her eyebrows that was his line, that he'd seen in the mirror since he was 12 years old. She was 8. She was at home with the neighbor's daughter, who babysat 3 nights a week, and didn't ask too many questions about why her hours were so irregular. He'd promised her he'd be home by 11. He raised 2 fingers toward Evelyn. She hit the PA switch. The tone that went through the building was a 3-second burst of static feedback, the specific unpleasant frequency that made people's shoulders go up and their attention scatter. And Nathan was through the door before it stopped. He was not going to describe what happened next in terms of choreography, because it wasn't choreographic. It was fast and it was messy, and the second man got an elbow into Nathan's ribs before Nathan finished with the first one, which was going to be a bruise by morning. But it was over in the time it took the static tone to fully dissipate, and when Evelyn came through the connecting door, both men were on the floor and Nathan was crouched in front of Richard Ashford, working on the zip ties at his wrists with a multi-tool from his jacket pocket. Ashford looked at him with the controlled expression of a man who'd been sitting in a chair with his hands bound for 20 minutes and had decided somewhere in that time that panic was beneath him. "You're the security contractor," Ashford said. "Temporary hire," Nathan said. "Right." He looked at his wrists as the zip tie came off, and he rubbed them once with the automatic gesture of someone checking the damage, then stopped because he didn't want to show how much it hurt. "Where's Evelyn?" "Here," she said from the doorway. He looked at her for a long moment, the particular look of someone who has been worried about a specific person for a very specific length of time and is now recalibrating that worry into something more manageable. "You're all right," he said. "I'm all right. Are you?" "I've been better." He let Nathan help him to his feet, which cost him something in pride, but he accepted it without comment. "I should have told you earlier. I found the discrepancy 3 days ago in the security contract files, shell company billing, authorization signatures that didn't match the register. I thought I was misreading it. I convinced myself I was misreading it." "You weren't," Nathan said. "No." He straightened his jacket with the precise automatic motion of a man who'd been straightening jackets in difficult rooms for 40 years. "I know who's behind this." Evelyn and Nathan both looked at him. Ashford looked at Nathan specifically, with an expression that had moved past the difficulty of what he was about to say into something calmer on the other side of it. "There's a private security organization. They go by the name Sentinel Meridian Group. Not this hotel, different name, same word. They contract with corporations for what they call deep infrastructure security. The contracts go back years, sometimes decades. They don't just provide security. They embed inside companies. They build access slowly. And when the time is right, they own the inside," Nathan said. Something shifted in his chest. Not physical, or not only physical, a recognition that moved through him like cold water from his throat down. Sentinel Meridian Group, he knew that name. Not from a briefing, not from a corporate file. From a different context entirely, spoken in a different room years ago by a man who died 3 weeks after saying it. His SEAL team's operations coordinator. The one who'd tried to warn them before the ambush that had killed 4 members of the team and had killed Sarah. Not Sarah the operator, Sarah his wife, who'd been working as a civilian intelligence contractor attached to the same operation, because they had been two people who moved in the same dangerous world and had found each other in it and had never fully reckoned with what that meant until it was too late to reckon with anything. The ambush had been covered up. The investigation had been closed. The official report had said hostile action, unforeseeable, no internal failure, a conclusion that Nathan had never believed and had spent the 3 years since then unable to disprove. He stood in the anteroom of the Grand Meridian Hotel's second floor, and the name Sentinel Meridian Group sat in the air in front of him like something physical, and he breathed in slowly through his nose because the alternative was something he couldn't afford right now. "Tell me everything you know about them," he said. His voice came out even. He was grateful for that, at least. Ashford studied him for a moment with the eyes of a man who was very good at reading rooms. "You've heard the name before," Ashford said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "Not in a professional context." "No." Ashford nodded slowly, as if he was making a decision about how much to trust someone based on information he didn't fully have, which was always how those decisions got made. "They've been embedded in Hawthorne Dynamics for 8 years. The contracts were signed by Marcus Hale." Nathan had met Marcus Hale exactly once, in the pre-shift briefing at 4 o'clock, for approximately 45 seconds. Chief of Security, 62, quiet, the kind of authority that didn't need to announce itself. Nathan had clocked him as competent and moved on, because competent was the baseline, not the ceiling. 8 years. He thought about what 8 years inside a company looked like. 8 years of access, of relationships, of trust built incrementally in the way that only time could build it. 8 years of learning every system, every protocol, every person who mattered, and every person who didn't. 8 years was not a crime of opportunity. 8 years was architecture. "Where is Hale right now?" Nathan asked. "I don't know," Ashford said. "He wasn't in the ballroom when they moved on Evelyn. I noticed that before they brought me here." Nathan thought about Colton, the head of security, the one who'd dismissed his report, the one who'd positioned him out of the way. Colton was mid-level. Colton was a piece of the operation, but not the design of it. The design of it had a different signature. "The server room," Evelyn said suddenly. Both men looked at her. "The Emergency Executive Protocol Terminal, the one they need me to authorize. Its primary node is in the building server room, level B2. That's also where the company's backup data architecture is housed. If someone wanted to copy and transfer the intellectual property during the authorization window," she stopped. "That's where the operation is going to finalize," Nathan said. "And if they want to cover their tracks afterward," she said, and her voice was very steady, "they'd need to destroy the server room's physical records, every transaction log, every access file." Nathan thought about the duffel bag he'd found behind the linen cart. The weight distribution. Dense, low center. Not weapons. Not surveillance equipment. Accelerant. He looked at the two men on the floor. Unconscious, zip-tied now, with their own restraints. No threat for the next 20 minutes at least. And then he looked at Evelyn and Ashford. "We need to move again," he said. Neither of them argued. Down the corridor, somewhere on a floor above them, he heard the distant sound of footsteps moving in a coordinated pattern. Multiple sets, systematic. The sound of people who'd been told to find 3 specific individuals and were working the building methodically until they did. Nathan started walking. The stairwell to B2 was accessed through a door marked Authorized Personnel, Restricted, which was the kind of signage that worked perfectly well against people who followed signs and did absolutely nothing against everyone else. Nathan took the stairs 2 at a time with Evelyn and Ashford behind him, moving fast but not reckless, because reckless was what happened when you let urgency outrun judgment. Ashford was slower on the stairs than he'd been in the corridor. He didn't say anything about it. He just moved at the pace his 61-year-old body allowed and kept up as well as he could, and Nathan adjusted his own pace without making a production of it, because calling attention to someone's physical limitation in the middle of an emergency was the kind of thing that cost you their cooperation precisely when you needed it most. The B2 level has two entry points, Evelyn said, keeping her voice low as they descended. The main access corridor and a secondary utility entrance on the west side that connects to the mechanical systems for the HVAC. The utility entrance requires a different keycard tier, but facilities management level, which your MasterCard covers. Should. She paused, assuming Colton hasn't flagged it for deactivation. Nathan thought about Colton, about the flat dismissal on the radio, about a man who'd been managing a security team in a building that had been quietly infiltrated over 8 years, and the question of whether that made Colton a participant or simply someone who'd been used and kept in the dark. Both possibilities were dangerous, but in different ways. A participant would have already flagged her card. Someone who'd been used might not even know the flag was necessary. "We try the utility entrance first," he said. "If it doesn't work, we adapt." They reached the B1 landing and kept going. The air got cooler and drier as they descended, the industrial kind of climate control that existed for equipment rather than people. Nathan had been in enough server environments to recognize the smell: filtered air, subtle electrical heat, the faint chemical note of cooling systems running at capacity. Hawthorne Dynamics server infrastructure was housed in a dedicated suite behind a series of security doors, and from what Evelyn had told him, it contained not just the emergency protocol terminal, but the company's entire proprietary data architecture. Years of AI development, defense contracts, encryption patents, the kind of asset that, if you had executive authorization in 72 hours, you could systematically hollow out, and no legal structure in the country would be able to stop you mid-process. Nathan had been in the military long enough to understand what made a target worth protecting. It wasn't always people. Sometimes it was the thing that people had built, because the thing that people had built was what other people depended on without ever knowing it. They reached B2. The utility entrance was on the west wall of a maintenance corridor that smelled like pipe insulation and standing water from a drain that wasn't draining quite right. Nathan held Evelyn's MasterCard to the reader and waited. The light turned green. He let out a breath he hadn't been aware he was holding. The door opened into a narrow passage that ran parallel to the main server corridor, separated from it by a half wall of conduit and cable management infrastructure. Through the gaps in the conduit, he could see the main corridor clearly. The lighting was low and functional, and the server room's glass-paneled door was visible at the far end. Also visible, two men stationed outside the server room door. And past them, through the glass panel, the silhouette of someone standing at a workstation terminal. Nathan studied that silhouette for a long moment. He'd only seen Marcus Hale for 45 seconds during the pre-shift briefing, but the body language was specific. The particular stillness of a person who'd been waiting a very long time for something and had finally arrived at the moment of it. There was something almost ceremonial about the way the figure stood at the terminal. Patient, settled, like a man at the end of a long road who'd stopped to appreciate the view. "That's Hale," Nathan said quietly. Evelyn pressed close to the conduit to look. He felt her go very still beside him. "He's at the authorization terminal," she said. "Can he activate the protocol without you?" "No, he needs my biometric confirmation, but he can pre-stage everything, load the transfer parameters, configure the destination authorization, set the timer on the transfer sequence. When I'm brought to him, all he needs is 30 seconds of my cooperation, willing or not." "Biometric can be forced?" "The retinal scan is passive. It reads as long as the eye is open." She said it flatly, which was worse than if she'd said it with fear. Nathan filed that under things he was not going to allow to happen. "The secondary control room," Ashford said from behind them. Both Nathan and Evelyn turned. Ashford was looking at the floor plan schematic mounted on the maintenance corridor wall, a fire safety diagram, the kind of thing that got updated every few years when the fire inspector came around. He pointed to a room designated secondary systems on the diagram. "It's adjacent to the server suite, east side. Separate entry. If there's evidence of how this operation was constructed, authorization logs, contract files, communication records, they'd be accessible from a terminal in there." Nathan looked at the schematic. The secondary control room had a single door that opened off a short perpendicular corridor, not visible from the position of the two guards outside the main server room. "Can you get into that room?" he asked Evelyn. She studied the schematic. MasterCard should work. It's on the same access tier as the facility's management areas. Then that's where we start. He turned to Ashford. You stay in this corridor. If anything comes through that utility door, you hit the floor and you stay there. Ashford looked like he wanted to object. Then he looked at the two guards visible through the conduit gap, and he made the calculation that most people made when they were honest with themselves about the difference between being useful and being in the way. All right, he said. Nathan moved through the rest of the maintenance corridor with Evelyn behind him, staying low, keeping to the wall. The conduit provided cover for most of the route. At the junction where the maintenance passage connected to the main B2 corridor, Nathan stopped and counted the guards' sightlines. Both men were oriented toward the server room door, which meant the perpendicular corridor to the secondary control room was in their peripheral vision at best. Peripheral vision was manageable. He moved into the perpendicular corridor in one smooth motion, pulling Evelyn with him, and they were out of the guards' direct sightlines before either man completed his next slow scan of the area. Nathan pressed them both flat against the wall and waited for 4 seconds. No alarm, no raised voices. The secondary control room door was 7 feet ahead. Evelyn swiped the card. Green light. Door open. They went in. The secondary control room was smaller than Nathan expected. 8 feet by 12, crowded with server rack extensions and a single workstation that looked like it hadn't been the primary terminal for anything in several years. The monitor was dark, but the system was live, which he could tell from the indicator lights on the rack units along the back wall. Evelyn sat down at the workstation and woke the monitor. It asked for credentials. She typed without hesitation. Her executive credentials, the same ones that presumably still worked because the whole point of tonight's operation was to use them rather than replace them. The system unlocked. What am I looking for? She asked. Security contract files. Anything under Sentinel Meridian Group. Authorization signatures, billing records, communication logs between Hale and outside parties. Nathan stood behind her, watching the door, watching the monitor in his peripheral vision. Anything with a date trail. She navigated the file architecture quickly, with the efficiency of someone who'd designed parts of it. Nathan watched her hands on the keyboard, not hesitant, not searching, just moving. She knew where to look the way you know where things are in your own house. Here, she said quietly. The screen filled with a file directory under the header Infrastructure Security, SMG Contract. The date of the initial contract was listed in the top corner, 8 years, 4 months, and 17 days ago. Nathan read the summary header. Sentinel Meridian Group had been contracted as a supplemental security infrastructure provider, technical auditing, system monitoring, personnel background verification. The kind of contract that put people inside a company's security apparatus in ways that looked completely legitimate from every external angle. Scroll to the most recent files, he said. She did. The most recent files were dated 3 weeks ago. Communication logs between the SMG account and an internal Hawthorne Dynamics security address. The internal address had a user ID attached to it that, when Evelyn cross-referenced it in the personnel directory, resolved to a name, Marcus Hale. He's been communicating with SMG directly for 8 years, Evelyn said, through an account that was supposed to be an automated system address. Nobody would have had a reason to look at it. Nobody except Richard, Nathan said, thinking of what Ashford had told him upstairs. The discrepancy in the billing files. The shell company. The authorization signatures that didn't match. He found the thread and started pulling it. And Hale found out he'd found it. She paused. That's why Richard was moved before the main event began. Hale knew he couldn't risk Richard reaching me before the authorization sequence was locked in. Nathan was still reading the files over her shoulder, scanning fast, pulling relevant details the way he'd been trained to process intelligence, not word by word but pattern by pattern, looking for the architecture beneath the information. He found it in a file dated 11 months ago. It was a communication, encrypted, and then apparently decrypted for local storage by someone who'd gotten careless about housekeeping. The header identified it as an operational coordination record. The content was sparse in the way that careful people made things sparse. Abbreviations, reference numbers, no names except in one place. One place was enough. The reference number in the lower third of the document was a string of numbers and letters that Nathan recognized Not because he'd seen it recently, but because he'd spent 3 years trying to find it. It was the operational code assigned to the ambush that his SEAL team had walked into 4 years ago, in a situation that the official record described as an intelligence failure, and that Nathan had never believed was anything other than deliberate. The ambush where 4 of his teammates had died. The ambush where Sarah had died. His hands were very still at his sides. He was aware of them specifically, the way you become aware of things that might betray you if you're not paying attention. Nathan. Evelyn's voice was careful. She'd turned to look at him. He read the reference number again. Then he looked at the name that appeared below it in the document, the name that the reference number was cross-filed under in SMG's internal records. The name was his wife's name, not Sarah Mercer. Her professional name, the name she'd used for her civilian contractor credentials, the name that appeared on the operational paperwork she'd signed when she'd been attached to the joint operation. A name that appeared in exactly no public record of the ambush investigation because the investigation had been closed before it could reach the personnel files of civilian contractors attached to the unit. Sarah's name was in an SMG operational file, cross-referenced to a code number that matched the ambush, which meant Sentinel Meridian Group hadn't just been connected to the ambush in some peripheral corporate way. They had been involved in planning it. Nathan took a breath. It went in normally and came out slightly wrong. Not audible, but he felt the irregularity. He put one hand on the back of Evelyn's chair, not for support, but because he needed something physical to orient him while the rest of his operating system caught up with what his eyes had just processed. 4 years. He had spent 4 years knowing that the official account of his wife's death was wrong, and being unable to prove it, unable to find the thread that connected the ambush to anyone with a motive and the access to arrange it. 4 years of raising his daughter while that knowledge sat in the back of his chest like a foreign object his body had learned to work around. The thread was on this screen. "Can you copy this file?" he asked. His voice was even. He was grateful for that with a gratitude that was almost physical. Evelyn looked at him for a moment. Really looked at him, the way she'd looked at him in the ballroom when he was the only person moving. Then she turned back to the workstation and started copying. "All of it," she said. It wasn't a question. All of it. She set the copy running to a secure external address she accessed through the company's executive relay system. It would take 4 minutes to complete. Nathan watched the door and tried to think tactically instead of personally, because personally was a direction he couldn't afford to go right now, and the effort of not going there had a specific texture that he'd gotten familiar with over 4 years and had never quite gotten used to. "He knows," Nathan said after a moment. Evelyn looked up from the screen. "Hale. He knows that file exists, and he knows it's accessible from this terminal. That's why he's engineered a fire. The files in this room would be destroyed along with everything else. He's not just covering the theft of the company's IP." Nathan looked at the door. "He's destroying the evidence that connects SMG to operations that go back years. Operations that have nothing to do with Hawthorne Dynamics. He's been using the company," Evelyn said slowly. "The security contract, the 8 years of internal access. It was never only about the technology." "The technology is profitable," Nathan said, "but the access is what's irreplaceable. A security firm with a legitimate contract inside a company like Hawthorne has access to defense-adjacent systems, government contractor data, federal security audits. That's not just a corporate asset. That's an intelligence asset." She sat with that. The copy progress bar moved to 62%. "How do you know about the ambush connection?" she asked quietly. Not accusatory, just precise, in the way she was precise about everything. "Because it was my team." He paused. "And my wife." The room was very quiet for a moment, except for the low hum of the rack units and the faint sound of their own breathing. "I'm sorry," she said. Simple. No elaboration, no performance. The kind of sorry that didn't try to do too much. "The copy finishes first," he said. "Everything else is secondary." She nodded and turned back to the monitor. 78%. Nathan heard it at 83%. Not a sound from the main corridor. A sound from the utility entrance on the far side of the maintenance passage. A door, opened carefully. Footsteps, more than one set, moving with the deliberate quiet of people who knew where they were going and didn't want to announce it. He crossed to the secondary control room door and listened. Through the door, through the perpendicular corridor, he could hear the footsteps reach the maintenance passage junction and stop. Then a voice, quiet, measured, the voice of a man who'd spent 8 years doing exactly what he'd needed to do in exactly the way he'd needed to do it, and had arrived at the point where patience paid out. Marcus Hale. "Evelyn Brooks is in this room," Hale said. Not to Nathan, to whoever was with him. "The door has been accessed in the last 12 minutes. She found the secondary terminal." A pause. "Bring her out without damaging the biometric indicators. And find the contractor." Nathan looked back at Evelyn. She'd heard it. Her eyes were on the progress bar, 91%. He held up one finger. "Wait." And she held very still. The footsteps moved into the perpendicular corridor. 2 sets, Hale and one other. They stopped outside the secondary control room door. A knock. Deliberate. Almost polite. "Ms. Brooks?" Hale's voice through the door was calm in the way that deep water is calm. Not still, just surface level, undisturbed. "I want you to know that tonight doesn't require you to be harmed. The authorization process takes 30 seconds. After that, you and your colleagues walk out of this building, and what happens next is a matter for lawyers and federal investigators. Nobody gets hurt." Evelyn looked at Nathan. He shook his head once. "I found the SMG files," she said, loudly enough for Hale to hear through the door. "The contract records, the operational cross-references." She paused. "The ambush documentation." Silence. When Hale spoke again, the surface-level calm was still there, but something underneath it had shifted. Not broken, just reconfigured. The shift of a man who'd built something very carefully over a long time and had just learned that one unexpected variable had found its way inside. "Then you understand that the evidentiary value of those files depends entirely on whether they're intact when investigators arrive," he said. "And you understand that the building's fire suppression system on this level has been disabled for routine maintenance." Not routine maintenance. Nathan had known that since he'd found the duffel bag. The fire suppression system had been disabled as part of the plan to ensure that when the accelerant in that bag ignited, there would be nothing to slow it. "The copy finishes in 42 seconds, Evelyn said, again loudly. She was talking to Nathan as much as to Hale, telling him the countdown. "Open the door, Ms. Brooks. When the copy finishes." Nathan positioned himself against the wall beside the door. The hinge side, not the handle side, because people always looked at the handle side when they came through a door, and the hinge side gave him 2 extra seconds of not being where they expected him. He thought about Ashford in the maintenance corridor. He thought about the open FBI line in the mechanical room and whether anyone had traced it yet. He thought about 470 people still in the Grand Meridian ballroom above them, being managed by whatever operatives Hale had left up there, and what those people's evening looked like if the server room below them caught fire. He thought about his daughter's face, the line between her eyebrows when she was concentrating. He stopped thinking about it because there was nothing useful in it right now. The door opened. The man who came through first was not Hale. It was a younger operative, mid-30s, the same professional build and deliberate movement as the men from the ballroom. He came through looking left toward the workstation where Evelyn was sitting. Nathan was on his right. He had the man controlled and neutralized before the door had fully swung open. One clean motion, efficient, the kind that worked because it didn't start with hesitation. The man went down and Nathan came out from behind the door, already facing the corridor. Hale was standing 4 feet away. He was 62 years old, and he held himself like someone who had not spent those 62 years behind a desk. He was looking at Nathan with an expression that Nathan hadn't quite expected. Not surprise. Assessment. The look of someone encountering a variable he'd identified and miscalculated, and was now correcting the calculation in real time. "Mercer," Hale said. Nathan hadn't told him his name. He'd been a badge number and a radio call sign, and Hale had known him by name. "You know who I am," Nathan said. "I know who you were." Hale's voice was even. "First SEAL Team 3. 4 deployments, operation record that would have been distinguished if your last operation hadn't been flagged for a review that never completed." He looked at Nathan with the specific attention of someone who'd read a file carefully. "I know about your wife." The word landed in Nathan's chest the way those words always landed. Not devastatingly, not anymore, but with a weight that never got lighter, only more familiar. Then you know why I'm interested in your SMG files, Nathan said. I know you think you're interested in them for the right reasons. Hale took one slow step to his left, not aggressive, just repositioning. What you don't know is how much of what happened to your team was already in motion before anyone at SMG touched it. The ambush wasn't our design, Mercer. We came in after, to manage what was left. To cover it up. To contain the damage. He said it like someone correcting a factual inaccuracy. The people who ordered that operation were not our clients. They were a problem that our clients needed managed. The file you found is a record of a cleanup, not a commission. Nathan looked at him for a long moment. You're offering me a trade, he said. I'm offering you the names of the people who actually ordered the ambush, the people who marked your team as acceptable losses and signed the paperwork. Hale paused. You've been trying to find those names for 4 years. I have them. I've had them for 4 years. Another pause. Help me walk out of this building tonight, and those names are yours. The secondary control room behind Nathan was quiet. Then Evelyn's voice, steady and clear. Copy complete. Nathan heard it. He kept his eyes on Hale. He thought about what 4 years felt like. He thought about what it cost to carry something you couldn't put down and couldn't resolve, the specific exhaustion of that, the way it made you careful in ways that your daughter noticed even when she couldn't name them. He thought about Sarah, not her face, but her voice, the specific quality of her voice when she'd been working through something difficult, calm on the surface. That same kind of surface calm that Evelyn had, that same quality of intelligence that didn't perform itself. He thought about what Sarah would have said if she'd been standing in this corridor instead of him. She would have said that the names didn't matter as much as he'd decided they did. She'd told him something like that once, a long time ago, about a different situation with a different kind of unresolved grief. She'd said that the thing you're trying to find is sometimes just the shape you've given to the thing you can't fix. He wasn't sure she'd been right about that. He'd never been sure. But he was sure about the 470 people upstairs. He was sure about the duffel bag full of accelerant. He was sure about a fire suppression system that had been disabled on a sub-basement level, which meant a fire down here wouldn't just damage server infrastructure. It would move up through the building's service channels toward the floors above. He was sure about his daughter, at home, waiting for him to be home by 11. No, Nathan said. Hale looked at him. Not angry, something more complex than anger. The expression of a man who had made a precise calculation and found the result genuinely surprising. You understand what you're refusing, Hale said. Yes. Those names disappear when I do. Whatever records exist, you found the fragment tonight, but the full record is somewhere you don't have access to. I'm the only living person who can give you a complete picture of what happened to your team. I know. And you're still refusing. Yes. Hale looked at him for 3 more seconds. Then something in his posture changed. A small shift, a decision being made and settled. He reached into his jacket. Nathan moved. What followed was not a 24-second sequence like the ballroom. It was slower and harder, and considerably less clean, because Hale was not a man who'd been standing in position waiting for someone to approach. He was a man who'd spent 30 years in operational security environments and had stayed alive through all of them by knowing when a situation had changed and responding faster than the change expected. He was fast. Nathan had been in enough difficult rooms to know immediately when someone was actually fast, and Hale was. He was also 62, and Nathan was 37, and in a contained space with no lines of retreat and no cover, 37 and 37's particular set of physical attributes mattered in ways that time had not yet finished calculating between them. They went into the corridor wall together. Nathan took an elbow to the jaw that snapped his head sideways and made the fluorescent light overhead stutter briefly in his vision. He answered it with a knee to the exterior of Hale's right thigh, the precise target, the femoral nerve bundle, that dropped Hale's right side enough to change his balance. They went to the floor. The weapon Hale had been reaching for, a compact sidearm, skidded across the concrete floor and came to rest against the base of the conduit rack. Neither of them went for it. The distance was wrong for both of them. Nathan got his left arm around Hale's right and put his weight into it in a way that was not comfortable for anyone involved and was not designed to be. And Hale fought it with the controlled fury of a man who understood precisely what was being done to him and was trying to find the counter in the 6 seconds before it stopped being possible to find one. He didn't find it. Nathan held the position until Hale's resistance pattern changed. From active to managed, the specific shift that meant the body had made a decision the mind hadn't finished making yet. He held it 3 seconds longer, to be sure. Then he sat back on his heels and breathed. His jaw ached. His ribs, where the elbow had caught him from the ballroom fight earlier, had a new opinion about things. He put both hands on his knees and looked at Hale on the floor. Hale was breathing, controlled through his nose, the way a man breathed when he was processing pain without letting it become the whole story. "The names," Nathan said. He heard the roughness in his own voice and didn't try to smooth it. "You're going to give them to federal investigators, not to me. To investigators. Under oath. Because that's the only way they mean anything that lasts." Hale looked up at him from the floor. "You think that matters to you now," Hale said. "You'll regret this." "Probably," Nathan said. He stood up, slowly, and walked back into the secondary control room where Evelyn was already on her feet, the copy confirmed complete on the monitor behind her. She looked at him, at his jaw, at the way he was holding himself, and she didn't say anything immediately, which was the right call. Then, "Are you all right?" "I've been better," he said. It was what Ashford had said upstairs, and he hadn't meant it to echo that, but it did, and somehow that was all right. "The files are transmitted," she said. "Secure relay. They'll have everything." "Good." He moved to the door, looked into the corridor. Hale was still on the floor, not unconscious, but not interested in moving yet. The first operative was similarly down. "We need to secure Hale, find Ashford, and deal with the accelerant device before any of Hale's remaining people decide to trigger it manually." "How much time do we have?" Nathan looked at his watch. The gala had been running for an hour and 40 minutes. The federal response to his open phone line should have been on site for some time now. But getting through a building controlled by hostile operatives, without triggering a panic among 470 civilian guests, took time that federal protocols were not designed to shortcut. "Not enough," he said honestly. They moved back into the maintenance corridor, and Nathan found Ashford exactly where he'd left him, flat against the wall near the utility entrance, because Ashford was a man who followed instructions when they made sense, and this one had made sense. Ashford looked at Nathan's jaw with the expression of a man who'd been a lawyer for 40 years and had learned to read rooms by reading people. "Hale?" Ashford asked. "Secured. Temporarily." Nathan moved past him toward the utility entrance. "The accelerant device is still active. I found the primary staging bag earlier, Northeast service corridor, main building level. But if the fire suppression is disabled down here, there are secondary devices as well." "How do you know?" Evelyn asked. "Because one bag in one location doesn't disable a suppression system on a different level. Whatever's down here was placed here, separate from what's upstairs." He pushed through the utility entrance and back into the maintenance corridor. Hale planned this for the server room specifically. The upstairs device is cover. The real target is this floor. They moved through the maintenance corridor with the copy transmitted, with Hale secured, with the clock running down on whatever remained of the evening's architecture. And somewhere in the building above them, 470 people were sitting in a ballroom waiting for someone to tell them it was over. Nathan was not yet in a position to tell them that. He kept moving. The maintenance corridor felt narrower on the way back than it had on the way in, which was the particular illusion of high-stress environments. Spaces contracting as the variables inside them multiplied. Nathan moved fast, Evelyn and Ashford behind him, working through the layout in his head the way he'd been trained to work it. Not as a building, but as a system. Each room a node, each corridor a connection, each locked door a decision point with a cost attached. He needed to find the secondary accelerant device before anyone with access to a remote trigger decided that the evening's primary plan was unsalvageable and moved to the contingency. The contingency, he was increasingly certain, was burning the evidence and walking away from the rest. The server room has its own power circuit, Evelyn said from behind him. She was keeping pace, her heels making a sharp sound on the concrete that she'd long since stopped trying to muffle. Independent of the main building grid. If someone wanted to trigger an ignition device on this level without accessing the room physically, they'd route it through the circuit controls, Nathan finished, which are in the main electrical panel for this level. East wall of the mechanical systems corridor, past the HVAC units. He adjusted direction without breaking stride. Behind them, sealed in the secondary control room with zip ties, and a door that required a keycard to open from the inside, which it didn't have, Marcus Hale was no longer Nathan's immediate problem. That was a temporary condition, and he knew it. Hale had people in this building, people who hadn't been neutralized, people who might already be moving toward B2 in response to communications that had gone quiet. But temporary was all Nathan needed right now. Temporary was workable. They reached the HVAC corridor. The mechanical systems here were loud in the specific way of industrial climate control, a constant low-frequency vibration that you felt in your sternum more than you heard with your ears. 3 large duct units lined the north wall, and past them, mounted in a recessed alcove behind a gray steel panel, was the electrical distribution board for the B2 level. The panel was already open. Nathan stopped. Evelyn stopped behind him. The panel was open, and someone had been at it recently. He could see the marks in the dust on the panel housing, finger smudges at the edges, and more relevantly, he could see what had been added to the circuit board's lower tier. A small device, matte black, roughly the size of a deck of cards, adhered to the board housing with industrial tape and connected to 2 of the circuit feeds with leads that were thin enough to look like standard wiring if you weren't looking for them. He crouched in front of it. "Remote trigger," he said. "Receiver unit. It listens for a radio signal on a specific frequency and closes the circuit when it gets one." "Which would do what to the accelerant?" Ashford asked. "The accelerant isn't just flammable material in a bag. The bag was the staging component. It's connected to a dispersal mechanism. When the circuit closes, the dispersal activates, spreads the accelerant across the target area, and the ignition source in the device triggers it." He studied the connections. The device upstairs is the same design, probably. 2 separate trigger points, same receiver frequency, controlled remotely. "Can you disable it?" "Yes." He studied the lead connections. But not by pulling the leads. If it's designed with a failsafe, disconnecting the power feed triggers ignition rather than preventing it. That's standard design for this type of device. You disable the receiver, not the circuit. "How?" He looked at the device for a moment longer. The receiver unit had a small antenna stub on its upper edge, barely visible, pressed flush against the panel housing. The antenna was the vulnerability. Without the antenna receiving the trigger signal, the device was inert regardless of what the circuit did. "I need something non-conductive, thin enough to fit between the antenna and the housing, and rigid enough to physically block the connection point." He looked around the corridor. "A piece of plastic, rubber, anything that isn't metal." Evelyn reached into her clutch, the clutch that had survived everything the evening had thrown at it with the same durability its owner had, and produced a hotel keycard, plastic, standard thickness, slightly flexible. He took it without comment and worked the edge of the card between the antenna stub and the housing, applying pressure slowly and evenly, watching the card flex and then hold as it found the gap. The antenna lifted 2 millimeters off its contact point. He pressed the card the rest of the way in and held it there. "I need something to hold this in place." Ashford was already reaching into his jacket pocket. He came out with a money clip. Solid, flat, the kind that men of a certain generation used instead of wallets. He handed it over without being asked. Nathan wedged the money clip against the card, locking it in position against the panel housing. The antenna was now physically separated from its contact point. The receiver was blind. He stood up. "The upstairs device," Evelyn said. "Same problem, different floor?" He closed the electrical panel. "But the upstairs device is in the Northeast Service Corridor, which is where Colton's team has been operating." The name settled in the space between them with the particular weight of a variable that hadn't been fully resolved yet. Colton, the head of security, the man who'd dismissed Nathan's report, the man who'd positioned him out of the way. Nathan still didn't know with certainty whether Colton was a willing participant in Hale's architecture or someone who'd been managed and manipulated from within, kept close enough to be useful and far enough from the truth to be deniable. It mattered because it changed how he'd have to approach him. "There's another option," Evelyn said. Nathan looked at her. She held his gaze steadily. "The ballroom. Hale's people are still managing the guests. They need the situation controlled up there while the authorization sequence runs down here. If someone goes back to the ballroom and disrupts their control of the situation, it forces their operatives to respond. That pulls people away from the service level and leaves you exposed in the ballroom. I wouldn't be fighting anyone." She crossed her arms, not defensively, but with the particular posture of someone who'd made a decision and was presenting it, not asking for approval of it. "I know the authorization terminal's hidden safeguards. The protocol has a built-in verification delay, a series of secondary confirmations that only the CEO knows how to trigger. If I'm at the terminal, appearing to cooperate, I can slow the authorization process by cycling those safeguards without appearing to obstruct it. Buy you time to handle the upstairs device. That puts you in the room with people who need you for biometric authorization," Nathan said. "If they decide cooperation is taking too long, then they need me intact and functioning, which gives me leverage I wouldn't have anywhere else in the building." She met his eyes. "And I'd rather be the leverage in a room I understand than a variable in a corridor I don't." Nathan looked at her for a long moment. He thought about the 24 seconds in the ballroom and about every decision point since, and about the specific quality of Evelyn Brooks's judgment under conditions that would have unmade most people he'd worked with. She wasn't asking him to protect her from the decision. She was asking him to let her make it. "How long can you slow the process?" he asked. 8 minutes minimum, possibly 12, if I play the safeguards carefully." "I need 8. "Then you have 8. He turned to Ashford. "You go with her. Stay close. If the situation changes, I know what to do," Ashford said quietly. Nathan believed him. They split at the B2 stairwell, Evelyn and Ashford going up, Nathan going up separately via the east stairwell that would bring him out closer to the northeast service corridor without going through the main lobby. It was a longer route. It was also the route that kept him out of sight lines that Hale's remaining people might be watching. He moved fast and tried not to think about Evelyn walking back into the ballroom. He thought about it anyway. The east stairwell brought him out on the main floor's east side, past the conference rooms and into a back corridor that connected to the service level. The building was still unnaturally quiet in the way it had been quiet since the ballroom confrontation, the held-breath silence of a controlled situation that everyone inside knew was not normal, and nobody was sure how to navigate. He picked up his pace. The northeast service corridor was where he'd found the duffel bag behind the linen cart. He reached the corridor and entrance and stopped, pressing against the wall, reading the space before entering it. 50 feet of corridor, linen cart staged at intervals, the walk-in freezer units on the left, the service exit at the far end. The duffel bag was still behind the cart where he'd found it, which meant either nobody had moved the dispersal device to its final position yet, or the device's final position was always here, the service corridor itself, chosen because it connected directly to the building's main structural duct system. Nathan crossed to the cart in 8 quick steps and crouched behind it. The duffel bag was now open. Someone had been at it. The internal components were partially assembled, a flat dispersal unit connected to a cylindrical chamber that smelled sharply of petroleum distillate, and below that, the same matte black receiver box he'd seen in the electrical panel downstairs, its antenna extended and active. He looked at the antenna. Then he looked at his jacket pockets. The hotel keycard was still in the electrical panel downstairs, holding the money clip in place. He had no equivalent material on him. What he had was a folding multi-tool, his phone, his badge lanyard, 3 loose coins, and the earpiece he'd pulled out of his ear earlier and put in his jacket pocket. The earpiece. It was a standard security earpiece, the coiled acoustic tube type, with a small plastic receiver body and a rubber ear tip. The receiver body was hard plastic, roughly card thickness, and the ear tip was rubber. He pulled out the multi-tool, separated the earpiece body from the acoustic tube, and worked the plastic housing flat with his thumb against the corridor floor until the casing cracked along its seam and gave him a flat piece of hard plastic approximately 3 centimeters by 2. It wasn't ideal. It was what he had. He fitted the plastic shard between the antenna and the receiver housing the same way he'd done it downstairs, moving slowly, controlling his breathing, because the one thing you never did with an ignition device was hurry through your fine motor work. The shard seated with less confidence than the keycard had. The fit was imperfect, the piece slightly too small, and he used his thumb to hold pressure on it while he looked for a secondary lock. His badge lanyard, plastic clip, spring-loaded. He bit the spring mechanism open with his back teeth, which was not dignified, and he was aware of that, and worked the clip body around the antenna stub, using it as a clamp to hold the plastic shard in place against the receiver housing. He tested the pressure with one finger. Held. He sat back on his heels in the service corridor and let himself have 2 full seconds of just breathing. Then his radio, which he'd put back on his belt at some point without consciously deciding to, crackled. Colton's voice. "Whoever's in the northeast service corridor, I can see you on the monitor." Nathan looked up at the ceiling. There was a camera mounted at the corridor junction, one of the 11 he'd confirmed as live from the facilities management office. He'd forgotten about it, which was a failure he was going to examine later when there was time to examine things. He keyed the radio. "Colton? Mercer." A pause. "You want to tell me what you just did to that device?" "I made it inert, same as the one on B2. He stood. "Where are you?" "Monitoring station, first floor." Another pause, longer. "I've been watching the feeds for the last 40 minutes. Nathan waited. "I didn't know," Colton said. The voice was different from the radio voice Nathan had heard all evening. The authority was still there, but something underneath it had changed register. "About the cameras, about the devices, about Hale. But you knew something was wrong." A silence that lasted long enough to be its own kind of answer. "I noticed irregularities in the contract billing 3 months ago," Colton said finally. "I brought them to Hale. He told me it was an accounting reclassification, and he'd handle it." The voice had the flat quality of a man reading aloud from a document he wasn't proud of. "I let him handle it." Nathan thought about what that meant, about a man who'd noticed a thread and chosen not to pull it, not because he was part of the conspiracy, but because pulling threads was uncomfortable, and Hale was trusted, and the discomfort of being wrong was worse than the discomfort of letting it go. It wasn't courage, what Colton had done, but it wasn't treason either. It was the ordinary failure of a person who'd chosen comfort over clarity, and those failures were the ones that other people's carefully constructed operations depended on. "I need you to do something," Nathan said. "What?" "The FBI has an open line from the mechanical room to ground floor, maintenance access. They should have units in the building by now, or very close. Find the senior agent and tell them Marcus Hale is secured in the secondary control room on B2. Tell them there are 2 disabled accelerant devices, northeast service corridor main floor, and B2 electrical panel. Tell them Evelyn Brooks is in the ballroom voluntarily and needs immediate support." A pause. "And Hale's remaining people?" "How many are unaccounted for?" "Based on what I've been watching on the feeds, 4. 2 in the ballroom managing guests, 1 near the main entrance, 1 I lost track of near the B1 landing 20 minutes ago." "The one near B1 is going to find Hale," Nathan said. "That's your most urgent problem. Get federal agents to B2 before that happens." "Mercer," Colton's voice was tight. "I'm sorry. About earlier. About dismissing your report." Nathan stood in the service corridor with the disabled accelerant device behind him and the radio in his hand, and he thought about what to say to that. He thought about it for approximately 2 seconds. "Move fast," he said. "We can do the rest later." He put the radio back on his belt and started moving toward the ballroom. The ballroom anteroom was where the guests had been consolidated. Nathan could see through the small window in the anteroom door that the 470 people who'd been in the main ballroom during the confrontation had been moved, presumably to make the space more manageable. The 2 operatives managing them were visible at opposite sides of the room, maintaining the kind of professional distance that kept everyone in view without anyone feeling individually targeted. Nathan was not going through the anteroom. He went around it, through the kitchen access corridor, past the staging area where the shrimp cocktail station was still set up and completely untouched, through the service door on the ballroom's south side that led him into the ballroom itself from a direction that didn't pass either operative's sightline. The ballroom was nearly empty now. The chandeliers were still lit. The tables were still set. It looked like a gala that had paused mid-breath and hadn't figured out yet how to start again. At the far end of the room, near the stage, the authorization terminal had been deployed, a portable unit that connected to the building's network infrastructure, set up on a table that had been cleared of its original centerpiece. An operative Nathan hadn't seen before was standing at the terminal's side, and Evelyn was at the terminal. She was typing, slowly, deliberately, in the specific rhythm of someone who was doing something that required precision and was not going to be hurried into imprecision. The operative beside her was watching the screen with the tight attention of someone who understood what the screen was supposed to show and was noticing that it wasn't showing it quickly enough. "It's running the secondary verification protocol," Evelyn said, without looking at the operative. Her voice was the voice of someone explaining a technical process that she found mildly tedious and was going to explain correctly regardless. "There are 4 confirmation layers. They're sequential. I can't skip them." "How long?" the operative said. "As long as they take." She typed another sequence. "You can stand over me all evening, but the system doesn't process faster because you're nervous." The operative's jaw tightened. Nathan moved along the south wall toward the stage, keeping to the shadows thrown by the table configurations. He counted the steps between him and the terminal, between him and the operative, between him and the stage exit that connected to the service corridor where he'd have a clear path to the main entrance and whatever federal support Colton was bringing. He was 30 feet out when the operative's radio went. Not Colton's channel. A different channel. A shorter burst of static followed by a voice that spoke in code. Nathan didn't have the context to decode, but whose tone communicated clearly enough. Something had changed. Something had gone wrong. And the information was traveling up the chain fast. Hail. The operative near B1 had found the secondary control room. The operative at the terminal looked at Evelyn. Then he looked around the ballroom. Nathan was already moving. He covered the 30 feet in the time it took the operative to raise his radio to respond, and the response never got transmitted because Nathan's forearm was across the man's radio arm before the transmission cleared his throat, and the terminal was between Evelyn and the floor when the operative went down and knocked the table sideways. Evelyn caught the terminal with both hands before it hit the ground. "That was close," she said. She set the terminal upright on the tilted table. Her hands were shaking slightly, which he only noticed because he was looking for it, and she wasn't trying to hide it from him specifically, just managing it. "Did you slow it enough?" 7 minutes and 40 seconds. She looked at the screen. "The transfer sequence is staged, but not authorized. I cycled the 3rd and 4th confirmation layers twice each. The system read it as standard verification protocol. They didn't know I was stalling. 740 is enough." He looked toward the anteroom. "The agents need to know the ballroom is clear. I know how to get to the anteroom from here without going through the main door." She stood, pulling herself up to her full height with the deliberate posture of someone who'd decided that how you carried yourself in the last stretch mattered as much as how you'd carried yourself at the start. "There's a side corridor. Show me." They moved together toward the stage, and for a moment Nathan was aware of the strangeness of it. The empty ballroom, the Austrian chandeliers throwing amber light across 470 empty chairs, the centerpieces still intact on their tables, a room full of all the architecture of a celebration that had become something entirely different. The side corridor was where Evelyn said it was. Nathan went through first, found it clear, and held the door for her. In the corridor, 20 feet ahead, 2 people were approaching from the other direction. Nathan's hand came up. Then he saw the FBI tactical vests. The lead agent, a woman in her 40s with the economical movement of someone who'd cleared rooms for 20 years, saw Nathan at the same moment and raised one hand in a halt signal to the agent behind her while her other hand rested on the sidearm at her hip. "Nathan Mercer?" she said. "Yes." She looked at Evelyn. "Evelyn Brooks?" "Yes," Evelyn said. The agent lowered her hand from her weapon. "Agent Diana Reyes, FBI Chicago. We've had your phone line open for the last 41 minutes. She looked at Nathan with the specific expression of a federal agent who has processed the gap between what a situation was supposed to look like and what it actually looked like. "Your head of security briefed us on the downstairs situation. We have teams at B2 now. Hale needs to be in custody." "Yes, we're working on it." She looked around the corridor. How many hostile personnel are still unaccounted for on this level? One that I know of, possibly two. Nathan looked back toward the ballroom. The ballroom-adjacent anteroom has approximately 470 civilian guests being managed by two operatives. Neither operative had a weapon visible when I last had eyes on them, but assume armed. Reyes turned to the agent behind her and gave 3 quick hand signals that Nathan didn't know the Bureau's specific code for, but could read by context. Split, flank, hold. The agent moved. The accelerant devices, Nathan said. Disabled, per your description from the open line. Reyes looked at him carefully. You disabled both of them? Yes. Using a hotel keycard and a money clip. And an earpiece. She looked at him for one more second, absorbing the complete picture of Nathan Mercer in a way that he suspected she was going to be writing about in reports for the next several weeks. Then she moved her attention to Evelyn. Ms. Brooks, I need you to stay with Agent Kowalski. She indicated a third agent who had appeared from the service access behind them. While we secure the ballroom and the anteroom, can you do that? Yes, Evelyn said. Then, the authorization terminal in the ballroom needs to be secured. The transfer sequence is staged but not completed. If anyone with executive system access gets to that terminal, I understand. We'll handle it. Reyes looked at her once more, the look of someone making a fast assessment and deciding it's favorable. You did well tonight, Miss Brooks. I had help, Evelyn said. She glanced at Nathan, briefly, with an expression that didn't try to be more than it was. Reyes moved toward the ballroom. Nathan started to follow. Mercer. Reyes didn't look back. Stay with Agent Kowalski. There's still one unaccounted operative. Stay with Agent Kowalski. He stopped. He stood in the corridor and listened to the sounds of the ballroom response beginning. Controlled, professional, the specific sounds of people who'd been trained for exactly this kind of entry and were doing it correctly. And he made himself stay where he was, because the hardest discipline was knowing when your part was done and someone else's had started. Evelyn was beside him, and Ashford appeared from the anteroom side corridor a moment later, escorted by another agent, his jacket rumpled and his silver hair slightly disordered, but his posture still military straight in the way that some things never entirely left you. He looked at Nathan and gave a small nod that said several things without saying any of them out loud. Nathan nodded back. The next 40 minutes were not what people wrote about when they wrote about nights like this. The next 40 minutes were the long administrative tale of a crisis. Federal agents in body armor moving through a ballroom while 470 people who'd been sitting in a room under armed management for over an hour alternated between stunned silence and the particular chaos of people who'd been quiet for too long and had things to say. Guest medical checks. Witness statements. The careful unwinding of everything Hale's operation had put in place, piece, by people who'd been trained to do it carefully rather than quickly. Nathan sat on a folding chair in the anteroom that had held Richard Ashford captive an hour ago, and he let the medic who'd been deployed with the federal team look at his jaw and his ribs, and he told her honestly that the jaw was bruised and the ribs might be cracked, but he wasn't sure, and she told him that wasn't something he should be uncertain about, and he said he'd had a busy night. She taped his ribs and gave him a cold pack for his jaw and moved on to the next person. He checked his phone. 2 missed calls from the neighbor who watched his daughter, a text that read, "Lily is asking when you're coming home. Everything okay?" He looked at the text for a moment. Then he wrote back, "Tell her I'm on my way. I'll be there by midnight." It was going to be after midnight. He knew that. But the message was true in the way that mattered. He was going to make it home, and Lily was going to wake up in the morning with her father in the next room, and the world that contained that fact was intact. That was what he'd chosen when he'd said no to Hale's offer. Not nobility, not some cleanly principled decision made from a height, just a calculation about what mattered most when you stripped everything else away, and the answer had been the same answer it always was when he asked the question honestly. Agent Reyes found him in the anteroom 20 minutes later. She sat down in the chair across from him with the posture of someone who'd been on her feet for too long and wasn't going to admit it. "Marcus Hale is in federal custody," she said. "His personnel are being processed. The authorization terminal has been secured and the transfer sequence has been voided by our technical team. She paused. The evidence copy transmitted by Ms. Brooks reached our secure relay intact. All of it. Nathan absorbed that. The SMG operational files, he said. The ambush cross-reference. Reyes looked at him with the careful expression of someone who'd read the personnel files connected to this case and understood what she was looking at. Those files are part of the evidentiary package. They'll be subject to full forensic analysis. And the names attached to the ambush order, whatever Hale has access to. That will be part of his interrogation. She looked at him steadily. I won't promise you an outcome, Mercer. I will tell you that what you transmitted tonight is the most comprehensive documentary evidence I've seen in 15 years of federal work. If the names are findable, this is how they get found. It wasn't what he'd wanted from Hale's offer. It was slower, less direct, mediated by process and institutions and the particular patience that legal investigations required. It was also the only version that produced something that lasted, something that couldn't be traded away or revoked when the person holding it decided its value had changed. He nodded. Reyes stood up. Your statement. We'll need it tonight, then you're free to go. How long? 40 minutes, maybe less. She looked at him once more in that particular way she had. The way of someone deciding how to file a person they don't have an obvious category for. What you did tonight, Mercer. The devices, the evidence. Hale. She paused. That was not a typical night's work for a temporary hire. No, he agreed. I imagine you know that. I do. She left. Nathan sat with the cold pack against his jaw and listened to the anteroom filling slowly with the sounds of a situation being managed by people who were supposed to manage it, and he thought about his daughter's face. He thought about the line between her eyebrows, the way it appeared when she was doing her homework, and something wasn't adding up, and she hadn't decided yet whether to ask for help. He was going to be home by midnight. He would be a little late, but he would be home. And that was the only math that mattered at the end of the night, when the rest of the numbers had stopped moving. Somewhere on the other side of the building, through 3 floors and 100 corridors, Evelyn Brooks was talking to federal agents in the ballroom, and the Austrian chandeliers were still lit, and 470 people were finding their way back to something that resembled the evening they'd expected to have. Nathan closed his eyes for 30 seconds. Just 30. Then he opened them, stood up, and went to find the agent who needed his statement. He had a promise to keep by midnight. He was 43 minutes late. The neighbor's daughter, a 22-year-old nursing student named Carrie, who babysat 3 nights a week and had a policy of not asking questions that weren't her business, opened the apartment door before Nathan finished reaching for his keys, which meant Lily had been watching for him from the front window. She did that sometimes when he was late. He'd told her once that it was okay to go to bed, that he'd always come home, and she'd looked at him with the particular expression of an 8-year-old who understood the sentiment completely and had decided it wasn't sufficient reason to stop watching the window. She's still up, Carrie said, unnecessarily. Thanks for staying. He handed her cash more than the rate, because it was after midnight and she had a pharmacology exam in the morning that she hadn't mentioned, but he knew about because he knew her schedule the way he knew the schedules of everyone in Lily's immediate orbit. Carrie left, and Nathan stood in the doorway of his daughter's room. Lily was in bed with the covers pulled to her chin, which was how she slept when she was pretending to be asleep and how she never slept when she was actually sleeping. Because when Lily actually slept, she sprawled in a diagonal that occupied 80% of any available mattress space. She was watching him from under her eyelashes. I can see you, he said. She opened her eyes fully. You said midnight. I know. It's 12:43. I know. She studied him for a moment with the particular quality of attention that she'd had since she was small. The way she looked at things she was trying to understand, not just things she was trying to memorize. He was aware not for the first time that she was going to be someone significant when she grew up. Not in the way that parents told themselves their children were significant, but in the actual, observable, structural way that certain people were. The ones who noticed things and thought about what they meant and asked the questions that other people had learned to stop asking because asking them was inconvenient. Your face, she said. He'd forgotten about the bruise. The cold pack had brought the swelling down, but not enough to make it invisible to someone who knew his face the way his daughter knew his face. "It's fine," he said. "It's not fine. It's purple." "It'll be less purple tomorrow." She sat up, pulling the covers with her, and looked at him with an expression that was so precisely Sarah's that it stopped him in the doorway for a full second. Not painfully, just completely. The line between her eyebrows, the specific quality of a person deciding whether they were satisfied with an answer. "Did something happen at work?" she asked. He crossed to her bed and sat on the edge of it. The mattress was too soft. They needed a new one, had needed one for 8 months. It kept not being the right time to deal with it. He put his hand on top of her head, not ruffling her hair, just resting it there. "Something happened at work," he said. "I'm fine. Everyone's fine." He paused. "It was a complicated night. Were you protecting someone?" "Yes." She absorbed that. Then she lay back down and pulled the covers up again, not to chin height this time, but to her collarbone, which was her actual sleeping configuration. "Good," she said. He sat there for another minute, listening to her breathing slow and settle into the pattern that meant she was actually going to sleep this time. And he thought about what it cost to keep a promise to an 8-year-old when keeping it required walking into situations that had every reason to go wrong. He thought about whether the math of that was something he'd ever be able to fully calculate. He didn't think it was. He thought it was the kind of math that you just kept doing, day after day, without the comfort of a final answer. He turned off her lamp and went to bed. He lay there in the dark for a long time before he slept. The investigation moved the way federal investigations moved, simultaneously slower and faster than anyone outside them expected. Slower because evidence of this complexity, touching defense contracts and corporate infrastructure, and an organization that had spent years making itself look like something legitimate, required the kind of careful assembly that couldn't be rushed without being broken. Faster, because once the first thread was pulled, the threads beneath it came with a momentum of their own. In the first week, the FBI and the Department of Justice jointly announced the arrests of Marcus Hale, 11 Sentinel Meridian Group operatives involved in the Gala infiltration, and 4 individuals connected to the shell company network that had funded the operation over 8 years. Colton was placed on administrative leave pending an investigation into his role, not as a suspect in Hale's operation, which the evidence did not support, but for the professional failure of having identified irregularities and chosen not to pursue them. That investigation would take 4 months and result in a formal censure and voluntary resignation. Nathan didn't have strong feelings about that outcome. He thought it was probably the right outcome for a man who'd made the ordinary human mistake of choosing comfort over clarity, and he thought the 4 months of investigation were probably their own kind of consequence, regardless of the formal result. D. Colton had missed what Nathan had seen in the first 2 hours. That was true. But Nathan had spent 11 years in environments where missing things had immediate, irreversible consequences, which had a way of calibrating your attention that most people's professional lives never required. Holding someone to a standard that their experience had never demanded of them was a specific kind of unfairness that Nathan had learned over years and some painful iterations to be careful about. He gave his formal statement to Agent Reyes on the morning after the gala, sitting in a federal field office conference room with a cup of coffee that was worse than anything he'd made at home in the last 4 years. The statement took 3 hours. She asked good questions. Precise, not leading, the kind that created space for information rather than filling it. He answered everything honestly, including the part about Hale's offer and why he'd refused it. She looked at him when he got to that part with the expression he was becoming familiar with, the particular expression of someone encountering a variable they didn't have an obvious category for. "He offered you the names," she said, "the people who ordered the ambush." "Yes." "And you refused?" "Yes." She wrote something in her notes. Then she looked up. "Can I ask why?" Nathan looked at the bad coffee. "Because names given by a man trying to buy his escape aren't the same as names arrived at through evidence and process. Whatever he told me, I'd never be able to use it for anything that mattered. And whatever he didn't tell me, I'd spend the rest of my life not knowing whether it was the part that changed the picture." He paused. I'd rather have what you found in those files than what he was willing to trade. Reyes looked at him for a moment. The files are being analyzed. The ambush cross-reference and the associated operational records are part of a separate investigative thread that's being coordinated with the Department of Defense. I know. It's going to take time. I know that too. She closed her notebook. I'll make sure you're notified directly when that thread produces findings. Not through a press release, directly. He hadn't asked for that. He acknowledged it with a nod and didn't add anything to it, because there wasn't anything to add. He drove home and made breakfast for Lily, who had 4 questions about his bruise and 1 question about whether the person he'd been protecting was okay, in that order, which told him something about his daughter's priorities that he filed away with affection. Richard Ashford called him 10 days after the gala. Nathan was at the kitchen table going through a pile of expense receipts that had been accumulating since March, and was not the most engaging task he'd ever undertaken. He answered on the second ring. I wanted to check on you, Ashford said. Not as preamble to something else. Just that. Nathan leaned back in his chair. I'm fine. Ribs are still unhappy. Jaw is better. Good. A pause. I also wanted to say something that I didn't get a chance to say properly that night. You don't need to. I know I don't need to. I'm going to anyway. Ashford's voice had the quality it had in the secondary control room, past the difficult part and into whatever was on the other side of it. I spent 30 years watching people make decisions under pressure. Important people, educated people, people with resources and advisors and every possible institutional advantage. What I saw that night, the way you moved through that situation, the decision you made in that corridor with Hale, that wasn't training. Training is part of it. But training doesn't tell you what to choose when the choice is genuinely hard. Nathan was quiet. Evelyn is going to call you, Ashford said. When she does, listen to the whole thing before you answer. I'll listen. Good. Another pause, shorter. How's your daughter? She's fine. She's got strong opinions about my bruise. Ashford made a sound that was almost a laugh. Good for her. They talked for another few minutes about things that weren't the gala, which was its own kind of necessary, and then Nathan went back to his expense receipts with slightly less resistance than before. Evelyn called on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after the gala. Nathan was dropping Lily at school. He stood on the sidewalk outside the building and watched Lily navigate the crowd of arriving students with the specific confidence of an 8-year-old who'd decided she had places to be. And he answered the call. Good morning, Evelyn said. Morning. I've been trying to figure out how to start this conversation for about a week, she said. I'm going to skip the version where I do that gracefully and go straight to what I want to say. He almost smiled at that. Okay. What happened the night of the gala the coverage has been significant. The investigation, the arrests, the shell company disclosures. The board has been in emergency session for most of the last 3 weeks. She paused. And I've been rebuilding, internally and publicly, which is uncomfortable and necessary, and I'd rather be doing it than not. I heard you made a public statement. 2, actually. One the morning after, one a week later when more of the investigation details became public. Another pause. I didn't hide it. Any of it. The extent of the infiltration, how long it had been going on, what it cost us in terms of trust. She said it without drama, just as fact. A lot of my board members thought that was the wrong approach, that we should manage the disclosure more carefully. What did you think? I thought that Hale spent 8 years inside my company precisely because we were the kind of organization that managed information carefully, and I wasn't interested in continuing to be that kind of organization. A short pause. So I told the truth, publicly. And then I waited to see what that cost us. What did it cost? 11 major clients issued formal reviews of their contracts. 3 suspended operations pending investigation outcomes. 2 terminated outright. She said each item without softening it. And 14 new enterprise inquiries came in within 10 days. From organizations that said specifically that they'd been watching how we handled the situation and wanted to work with a company that operated that way. Nathan watched Lily disappear through the school's front door. That's not nothing, he said. It's not, she agreed. It also doesn't fix everything. The trust damage inside the company is harder than the external piece. People who worked alongside Marcus Hale for years are having to reckon with what they missed, what they ignored, what they chose not to ask about. That doesn't resolve quickly. No, Nathan said. It doesn't. A silence that was comfortable rather than empty. I want to offer you a position, Evelyn said. Acting Director of Executive Protection. It's a new role. We're restructuring the entire security function from the ground up, with independent oversight at every level. The acting designation is because I want the permanent structure built correctly rather than quickly, and that takes time. But the role starts now, because the need is now. Nathan leaned against the railing at the bottom of the school steps. A woman with a stroller navigated around him with a nod and kept going. Why me specifically? He said. Not false modesty. A genuine question, because the answer mattered to how he thought about the offer. Because you noticed what nobody else noticed. Because you reported what you saw even when it was dismissed. Because you disabled 2 ignition devices with a hotel keycard and an earpiece. A pause. And because when Marcus Hale offered you something you'd spent 4 years wanting, you said no. The last one isn't a professional qualification. No, it's a personal one, which is actually what I need most. She paused. I need someone who understands that the security function of this company exists to protect people, not to protect the company's image of itself. Those 2 things are not the same, and for 8 years we had someone in that role who decided they were. Nathan thought about that for a moment. He thought about Colton, who hadn't been Hale, but had also not been what the role required. He thought about what it would mean to build a security structure from the ground up with independent oversight, no single point of control, no architecture that could be quietly colonized by someone patient enough to wait. He thought about what it would mean to have a job where the principles didn't require him to choose. I have conditions, he said. Richard told me you would. He could hear something in her voice that wasn't quite amusement but was adjacent to it. Tell me. The security function reports to an independent oversight committee, not exclusively to executive leadership. No single executive, including you, has unilateral authority over security operations. That has to be structural, not just policy. Agreed, she said, without hesitation. Every critical decision in the security function has a documented second approval. No exceptions, no emergency bypasses, without a recorded rationale. Agreed. And I have a daughter who's 8 years old. There are things I will not miss for this job. Recitals, school events, the stuff that doesn't reschedule. That's not negotiable. A pause, slightly longer than the previous 2. Nathan, Evelyn said, and something in her voice had shifted. Not softer exactly, but more direct, more personal, the way a voice gets when a person stops presenting and starts just talking. I had a father who missed everything for his job. I built this company in part because I needed something to prove it was worth it to him that he did. And then I looked up one day and realized I was doing the same thing. She paused. The stuff that doesn't reschedule is exactly what I'd want you protecting. I'm not interested in a director of anything who's forgotten why protection matters. He stood on the sidewalk outside his daughter's school and thought about what it meant to find a place where the things you were asked to do matched the things you believed were worth doing. He'd spent 11 years looking for that in the military, and he'd found it. And then he'd lost it in one night in a situation that the official record still didn't fully account for. He'd spent 4 years since then doing work that was good enough and necessary enough, but never quite the right shape. I'll take it, he said. Acting, she confirmed. For now. One more thing. Tell me. Richard Ashford, whatever formal role he still holds in the company, the oversight committee structure should include him, not as a favor, because he's the one who noticed the billing discrepancy, and noticing it cost him a night zip-tied to a chair. That kind of attention deserves a formal place in the structure. A silence, and then something that was definitively a sound of amusement. He said you'd say that too, she said. He started on a Monday. The Hawthorne Dynamics building in downtown Chicago was a different building to walk into when you were walking into it as something other than temporary staff. Nathan noticed that without sentimentality and without overreading it, it was just true that the way you moved through a space changed when your relationship to it changed. And there was information in that about how much of what people called confidence was actually just legibility, knowing where you fit and being seen to fit there. His office was on the third floor, which was where the senior security function had always been housed. It was a good office, not large, not decorated, a window that faced west and would get afternoon light when the Chicago weather was cooperating, which was its own kind of optimism. Someone had put a desk in it and a chair and a filing cabinet and not much else. He liked it. His first meeting was with the 3 security team members who'd been on the legitimate end of the gala night operation, who'd been managed around, kept in the dark, given assignments that positioned them away from the actual vectors of the infiltration. They'd all spent the 3 weeks since the gala being interviewed by federal investigators and their own sense of their professional competence, which was a harder interview than the federal one. He sat across from them in a conference room and looked at 3 people who were waiting to find out what he thought of them. "You were set up," he said, "not individually, structurally. The system you were operating in was designed to keep you from seeing what you would have otherwise seen." He looked at each of them in turn. "That's not an excuse for anyone. It's a fact about how this kind of operation works. Understanding that fact is the starting point for building something that doesn't have the same vulnerability." One of them, a woman in her 30s named Vasquez, who'd been positioned at the main entrance on gala night, said, "We should have caught the camera feeds." "Yes," Nathan said. "Who had access to the monitoring system that night?" A pause. "The monitoring station was managed through Colton's team, which means the people who should have been catching feed anomalies were managed by the person who was managing the operation." Nathan put his hands on the table. "You couldn't catch it from where you were standing. The architecture prevented it. That's what we're fixing." He spent 2 hours with them going through the structural failures, not to assign blame, which the federal investigation had already done more thoroughly than he could, but to map the gaps, where the oversight had been singular instead of redundant, where the documentation had been manageable by one person instead of distributed across multiple independent records, where trust had been substituted for verification in ways that felt reasonable at the time and were catastrophic in aggregate. He'd spent 4 years being unable to fix the thing that had broken his life. He was not going to spend the next 4 years building another structure with the same vulnerabilities. When the meeting ended, Vasquez stopped at the door. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Sure." "When you reported the camera feed to Colton that night, when he dismissed it, why didn't you escalate further? You could have gone over his head." Nathan thought about that. It was a good question. It was actually the question he'd asked himself most in the 3 weeks since. "I did escalate," he said. "I called federal dispatch. I started moving toward the threat independently." He paused. "What I didn't do was make enough noise in the institutional channel. I filed it once, it was dismissed, and I trusted my own judgment over the institutional process." He looked at her. "Which, that night, turned out to be the right call. But it's not a principle I want to build a security function on. It's a principle that works when the individual judgment is right. The whole point of structural oversight is that it doesn't depend on any one person being right." She nodded slowly. "So we're building something that would have caught what you caught, even if you hadn't been there." "Yes," he said. "That's exactly what we're building." The federal investigation's findings on the ambush cross-reference came 6 weeks after the gala, delivered by Agent Reyes in person, which she'd said she would do and did. She sat across from Nathan in his west-facing office on a Tuesday afternoon when the Chicago weather was cooperating, and she put a folder on the desk between them that was thicker than he'd expected, which was either a good sign or a complicated one. The SMG files cross-reference 3 separate operational records related to the ambush, she said. "We were able to use those records to identify 2 individuals who held decision-making authority over the operation your team was assigned to. Both are now subjects in a joint FBI-DOD investigation." She paused. "One of them is a former government contractor who left the sector in the year following the ambush. The other is currently serving in an advisory role with a federal agency that I can name but won't put on record in a way that prejudices the investigation. Nathan sat with that. The investigation will take time, she said. Federal cases of this complexity, touching both civilian criminal conduct and military operational classification, don't resolve quickly. I want to be honest about that. I know. But the evidentiary basis we have now is stronger than anything that's existed in any prior attempt to examine this case. What you transmitted from that terminal that night is what makes this investigation possible. She paused. I thought you should know that. He looked at the folder on the desk. He didn't open it. Thank you, he said. She stood. One more thing. She picked up her jacket from the chair back. I've been doing this work for 20 years. I've interviewed a lot of people who've done things in difficult situations that were technically impressive and legally useful. She looked at him. What you did that night, not the tactical part, the decision part. I'm going to think about that for a while. After she left, Nathan sat in his office for a long time without doing anything specific. He thought about what it meant to wait for justice through a process, rather than taking it through a moment. He thought about what 4 years of carrying something felt like compared to whatever the next phase felt like, which he didn't have a name for yet. Not resolution. Resolution was a word for things that had clean endings, and this wasn't going to have a clean ending. It was going to have a gradual one, the kind that happened through incremental proceedings and legal findings and institutional processes that moved on their own schedule without regard for the internal timelines of the people they affected. He thought about Sarah, about her voice specifically, the way she'd talked through problems, not working toward a conclusion, but working toward clarity, which was a different thing. She'd believed that clarity was more valuable than certainty, that understanding what was true was more useful than deciding what you needed to be true. He'd spent 4 years needing to know who was responsible. He still needed that. But somewhere in the last 6 weeks, the need had changed shape, from something urgent and consuming to something that could wait, because it was now in motion in a system designed to produce answers, and adding his own urgency to that system wouldn't make it faster, only noisier. He opened his desk drawer and put the folder inside it. Then he closed the drawer. He had work to do. On a Friday, 3 weeks after that, Nathan picked Lily up from school and they walked to the taco place on Meridian Street that she'd been asking about for 2 months. It was not, as it turned out, particularly good. The chicken was dry and the salsa was clearly from a jar, which was a decision that he had opinions about but kept to himself because Lily had been anticipating this meal for 8 weeks and was eating her mediocre tacos with the complete satisfaction of a person whose expectations had been exactly met. "How's the new job?" she asked. She asked this with the specific gravity of a person who'd decided that job questions were adult questions and she was going to ask them properly. "Good," he said. "Complicated. Interesting. Do you like the people?" He thought about Evelyn, who had spent the last 3 weeks doing the harder work of rebuilding trust inside a company that had been quietly hollowed out, doing it without pretending it was easier than it was. He thought about Ashford, who had joined the oversight committee with the particular energy of a 71-year-old man who'd been zip-tied to a chair and had decided that was an excellent reason to be more involved rather than less. He thought about Vasquez and the rest of the security team, who were building something new with the specific seriousness of people who understood what it cost to get it wrong. "Yeah," he said. "I like the people." Lily nodded as though this had been the key question and had now been satisfactorily resolved. She went back to her dry chicken taco. "Dad?" "Yeah." "You never told me what happened to your face, the real version." He looked at her, 8 years old, with the line between her eyebrows. "The real version is I was protecting someone and it got physical and I got hit in the jaw," he said. "Did the person you were protecting end up okay?" "Yes." "Did you stop the bad guys?" He thought about Hale in federal custody. He thought about the SMG operatives being processed, the shell companies being unwound, the 11 major clients reviewing their contracts, and the 14 new inquiries that had come in because a company had decided to tell the truth. He thought about an investigation that was now in motion that hadn't been in motion 6 weeks ago. "Yeah," he said, "we stopped the bad guys." Lily considered this with the seriousness it deserved. Then she picked up the last of her taco. "Good," she said. "Same as before." He looked at her across the table in the taco place on Meridian Street, with its jar salsa and its dry chicken and its fluorescent lighting that was doing nobody any favors, and he thought that the thing people didn't tell you about the moments that mattered most was how ordinary they looked from the outside, how the most important things happened in unremarkable rooms, at mediocre taco places, in the space between one ordinary sentence and the next. The evening outside was early autumn, which in Chicago meant the light lasted longer than it had a right to, and the temperature couldn't decide what decade it was in. They walked home after, taking the long way because Lily wanted to, past the park where she liked the swings and the hardware store where Nathan always stopped to look at the window display for reasons he'd never fully articulated. She held his hand for part of the walk, then let go when she decided she wanted to walk faster, then fell back beside him when the faster walking lost its appeal. This was the rhythm of walking with an 8-year-old, and he knew it well enough that it was its own kind of language. He thought about what Evelyn had said on the phone, that she'd built a company partly to prove something to her father, and had looked up one day to find she'd built the same absence into her own life. He thought about how often the things people ran from and the things people ran toward turned out to have the same shape when you looked at them from far enough away. He wasn't certain he'd avoided all of that. He'd been away for deployments and long jobs and nights that ran past midnight. He'd been present in body and somewhere else in the parts of himself that Lily most needed to reach. He'd done better some years than others, and he told himself the math worked out, and some of it had, and some of it hadn't, and the honest accounting was probably somewhere he'd never finish making. But he was here tonight, walking the long way home because his daughter wanted to. 43 minutes late 3 weeks ago and 12 minutes early today, which was not a trend he was making promises about, but was a true fact about this specific evening. That was what he had to work with, the specific evening. He thought there was something important in that, something that applied not just to parenting, but to most of what mattered, that you couldn't fix the past version of yourself, and you couldn't guarantee the future version, and the only one you actually had jurisdiction over was the one walking down a Chicago sidewalk at dusk, holding his daughter's hand when she offered it and letting her go when she needed to go faster. The apartment building appeared at the end of the block. Lily saw it and decided she did want to walk faster after all, and he let her go ahead and watched her run the last half block with the uncomplicated energy of someone who hadn't yet learned to ration herself. He walked the last half block at his own pace. There was a federal investigation in motion. There was a security function being rebuilt from the ground up with independent oversight at every level. There were names in a folder in a desk drawer that would become findings in a process that would take its own time. There was a company choosing honesty over convenience, and a 71-year-old vice chairman on an oversight committee, and a brilliant 30-year-old CEO who decided that the most radical thing she could do was tell the truth and see who was still there afterward. There was a lot of work still to do, which was not a discouraging thought. It was just an accurate one. Nathan Mercer walked into his building on a Friday evening in early autumn, took the stairs instead of the elevator because the elevator was slow, and pushed open the door to his apartment where Lily was already pulling off her shoes in the entryway and asking if they could watch something before bed. He said yes. They watched something before bed, and that was enough for the specific evening.